And welcome back to Com 340 Rhetoric and Popular Culture. Hopefully, you're ready to get back into lessons after the quiz. And today, that lesson is going to be about Lloyd F. Bitzer. He's a rhetorician, and we're going to look at his view on rhetoric. Now, the reason that we're going to look at Lloyd F. Bitzer is because of his work, The Rhetorical Situation, which is released in 1968. Now, if we were trying to do a modern analysis, we would not use Lloyd Bitzer. And the reason we wouldn't is because rhetoric has sort of evolved to be relatively broad. And Bitzer's definition of rhetoric is pretty narrow, but it's narrow on purpose, right? He knows what he's doing. As far as sort of like a broad approach, probably not great for that reason. But for our purposes, it's particularly useful because Bitzer gives us a way to look at rhetoric that is very pointed. In other words, rhetoric that has a very clear purpose and an unabashed purpose, basically something that we know what it's trying to do. It's a fantastic way to analyze those kinds of artifacts, which popular culture tends to be, right? Especially when we're looking at mass commercial artifacts, they're aimed at the broadest audience possible, and as such, tend to be pretty obvious in what they're trying to persuade us of. And what they're trying to accomplish. So let's look to see what our buddy Lloyd and his rhetorical approach allow us to do, and why it's a good option for creating some analyses. The first thing that we've got to look at and understand is Bitzer's definition of rhetoric. And he views rhetoric as what I describe here as rhetoric in action, or persuasive action. He says a mode of altering reality by the creation of discourse which changes reality through the mediation of thought and action. He also tells us that language functions as a mode of action and not an instrument of reflection. What that means for us is that by impacting people's way of thinking, by impacting what they're doing with our messages, we're essentially altering reality. We're altering what the case is. And for rhetoric, reality is social. It's built on our interactions as individuals, our interactions as groups. So when we're able to fundamentally change those interactions based on our messages, we're changing reality. And so Bitzer views rhetoric as this reality altering persuasive action, but it's an action, it's an active process. It enables us to make changes, to rearrange things, and is not simply, as he mentions, an instrument of reflection. It's not just something that we use to look back on. It's something that we use to change what is the case. So let's look at how he defines the rhetorical situation. This gets a little complicated, but it's easy to understand if we break it down. Bitzer defines the rhetorical situation as a complex of persons, events, objects, and relations presenting an actual or potential exigence which can be completely or partially removed if discourse introduced into the situation can so constrain human decision or action so as to bring about significant modification of the exigence. Again, it sounds complicated. It's a little bit simpler than that. Basically, Bitzer is saying that something is the case, and we seek to change that something, and so that's rhetoric. For him, an exigence, as we'll look at in just a moment, is sort of like a source, a beginning. And so the rhetorical situation are those things which create an exigence, create a thing that we can impact and that we can change through our messaging, through our discourse. And the way that it works through our discourse is by constraining human decision or action. In other words, defining a set of proper thought or action for a given situation. Let's break it down a little bit more by looking at the component parts. First, we have exigence, right? And by exigence, we just mean a reason for communication, a purpose, a source. Bitzer defines it as that thing we want to change. He calls it an imperfection marked by urgency. It is a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be. So, exigence is really just what we're trying to avoid, what we're trying to change. Um, and this is sort of a definition through negation a little bit. Typically, we'd look at rhetoric and see, well, what is it trying to do? Like, what is this message trying to do? For Bitzer, if we're using his mode of rhetoric, then what we're looking at is what we're trying to change, what we're trying to impact, not what we're trying to make happen. It's sort of a reversal. But the exigence is the thing that we're trying to impact to audience. And here it's important to pay attention to the way specifically that Bitzer limits who he considers an audience. He defines them as only those persons who are capable of being influenced by discourse and of being mediators of change. So our audience for Bitzer is only the people who we can actually persuade to do something about the exigence, to change the exigence. Why is this helpful for us in studying popular culture? Again, because when we look at advertising, it's all about target audiences. And you're not going to waste the time, effort, and money that it takes to advertise on groups of people that have no chance to want or buy your product. You try to market it towards the people that you know are at least in the market for your product. And so this pretty constraining definition of audience is useful for us for that reason. And last are constraints. And constraints are basically just things that stand in the way of an audience responding properly to the exigence. In other words, things that keep people from eliminating the exigence. Bitzer says, every rhetorical situation contains a set of constraints made up of persons, events, objects, and relations which are parts or elements of the situation because they have the power to constrain decision and action needed to modify the exigence. An example, beliefs, attitudes, documents, facts, traditions, images, interests, and motives. Essentially, the constraints are just the things that keep an audience, as defined by Bitzer, they keep that audience from changing the exigence. And it could be things that they already believe. It could be ideas that they have. It can be literally documents or laws that stand in the way. And as a rhetorician under Bitzer, if you're not impacting those constraints, if you're not trying to remove those constraints, you're simply not trying to be persuasive. You're just simply not doing rhetoric. So it's very particular in that sense. Let's talk about fittingness, because fittingness is essentially what we can use to analyze different popular culture artifacts. Basically, we just look at the pieces of the rhetorical situation and ask ourselves how they're functioning and how they're working with a given artifact. For instance, do we actually work to eliminate the exigencies? And this is a bit different from typical rhetoric because we usually don't deal with the question of result, the question of impact or effect, because it's hard to tell that, and especially if we're doing a historical analysis, trying to figure out how one particular piece of rhetoric impacted people becomes difficult. Then we're doing more of a historiography or just straight up history, and that's not really in the purview of rhetoric. But for Bitzer, because it's so focused on purpose, on intent, we can actually do that a little bit because we're not looking so broadly at other things and how we've defined audience and exigence, that opens the door for us. So we can ask ourselves, does a piece of rhetoric work to change what it wants to change? And we can answer that and give reasons for why or why not. It's also important to look to see if we're meeting the audience's expectations. And typically, whether you've taken a public speaking class or not, you know the importance of audience expectations. It's sort of what they're coming to the speech with. But when we look at it from a public speaking or an oratory background, we really try to gauge how well you're engaging the audience's expectations. Like, to what degree of goodness are you doing it? For Bitzer, it's either you're doing it correctly or you're doing it incorrectly. He's definitely focused on if you do things correctly, then you will get the result that you want. Kind of like Nick Saban in that way. And the last concern, the last question we can ask based on fittingness is, does it operate within the constraints? And if it doesn't operate within the constraints, does a piece of rhetoric, does a message eliminate the constraints for its audience? If the answer is no, it's, again, not functioning correctly under Bitzer's definition. Let's talk about one more concern that Bitzer has, and it's not unique to Bitzer. It's timing. And of course, we know the three main appeals of rhetoric: logos, or the word, the argument; ethos, or the credibility or character of the speaker; and pathos, which is the emotional appeal or emotional impact of a message. Timing was also an appeal. It's sort of one that we didn't pull into the big three, as it were. But that appeal is kairos, and it's a sense of timing needed to address a rhetorical situation. And for Bitzer, he talks about the sense of timing needed to eliminate the exigence. If we were going to start talking now about how to prevent coronavirus from spreading in the United States, we're about 6 months too late for that conversation, right? So our timing isn't particularly great. Kairos is bad there, right? But timing, we can also think about other ways in which rhetoric functions to persuade its audience. So not just when it happens, but why it's happening, who it's attempting to persuade, the ways in which it's attempting to persuade those people as well. And so that's a bit different from just looking at how something functions to persuade. It gives us more room to analyze. We can ask deeper and more interesting questions. And as we go forward in these lessons, we will 100% absolutely be doing that. We will run our artifacts through the fittingness test, as it were, and be able to tell how Bitzer enables us to get a good analysis looking at a piece of rhetoric. So, have a good day, and we'll talk about that next time.